What does it feel like to be left behind by your own child? Not strangers, not neighbors, not society, but the boy you raised with your whole heart, the one you gave your life to. This isn't a story about age or weakness. It's a story about the quiet betrayal that doesn't bruise the skin, but scars the soul. She believed it was only for a few days. She believed her son would return. She was wrong. Mom, it's just for a week, maybe 10 days. I've got this business trip and I don't want you staying home alone. This place is really nice, 5 stars. Think of it like a little vacation. Ethan, my only son, stood in the lobby of the nursing facility, talking too fast, like he was trying to sell me something. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. His wife, Jenna, was next to him, already handing over paperwork at the receptionist's desk. She smiled politely at the staff, but she didn't say much to me. I forced a smile. You don't have to explain, sweetheart. I'll be fine. I wanted to make it easier for him. I didn't want him to feel guilty. After all, hadn't that been my role all his life? To absorb the hard parts so he could move through life a little lighter? I had packed only a small bag. A few blouses, my favorite cardigan, my Bible, and the quilt I'd sewn when Ethan was a boy. I didn't bring much because I believed I wouldn't be here long. Just a short stay, just until he came back. The lobby gleamed like a hotel. Shiny marble floors, a grand piano in the corner, vases of fresh flowers on every table. It even smelled fancy, lemon polish and lavender air freshener. See, Mom? Only the best for you, Ethan said, glancing at me. His voice carried that nervous edge I recognized. We rode the elevator up together. My room had a television, a recliner chair, and a window that overlooked a garden with roses lined up neatly like soldiers. Someone had already stocked the mini-fridge, pretending this was all okay. Ethan hugged me, stiff, awkward, as if I might shatter. I'll be back before you know it. Don't worry about me, I told him. Go focus on your work. His shoulders loosened with relief. That look on his face, as if my words had given him permission to walk away, stayed with me long after he left. The door closed behind him with a sharp click. That night, I sat on the bed, fully dressed, shoes still on. I stared at the door, expecting it to open again, expecting Ethan to come back in, smiling, saying, I couldn't leave you, Mom. Let's go home. But the door stayed closed. The next morning, I wandered the halls. There were other women here, some asleep in wheelchairs, some staring out windows, some mumbling half-remembered prayers. The nurses were kind, but it was the kind of kindness you give to patients, not family. They spoke gently, too gently, like I was fragile. I told myself again, this is temporary. Ethan will come back. 3 days later, I called him, straight to voicemail. I left a cheerful message. Just wanted to check in, honey. Everything's fine here. I love you. No reply. On the 5th day, I tried again. Still voicemail. I hope work's going all right. Don't forget your mom's waiting to hear from you. No reply. By the 7th day, I stopped calling, but I still sat by the window, watching the garden path. Each time a car pulled in, my heart jumped. Each time footsteps passed in the hallway, I turned, waiting, but the knock never came. The days started to bleed together. Breakfast at 7, a walk in the garden at 9, soup at noon, movie night on Thursday, Sunday service on the TV. The routine pressed against me like a heavy blanket, smothering, endless. One evening, I opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside was a blank. I wrote about the day I met David, my husband, in church, when he offered me his hymnal because I had forgotten mine. I wrote about the night Ethan was born, how small he was, how fiercely I promised to protect him from everything. I wrote about the summer we drove across the country in a second-hand Chevy, eating sandwiches at rest stops and laughing until our stomachs hurt. I didn't write to be remembered. I wrote so I wouldn't forget. Forget that before I was just another old woman in a care facility, I had lived a life full of color. Forget that before I was room 214, I was a wife, a mother, a woman who worked, prayed, fought, and loved. And when I set the pen down, something stirred inside me. A thought I didn't want to believe but couldn't deny. No one was coming back. This wasn't a pause. This was the beginning of something else. Silence has many shapes. Sometimes it hums like an empty room. Sometimes it settles soft as dust. But the silence that followed Ethan's departure was different. It pressed against me like fog, heavy, invisible, impossible to push away. The days fell into routine. Breakfast at 7 sharp, scrambled eggs, toast, weak coffee. A walk in the garden at 9, where the roses were clipped to perfection, every petal controlled, manicured. Bingo on Wednesdays, though I never played. I preferred the small library on the second floor, even if half the books were missing pages or smelled of mildew. The staff checked on me often, smiling too much, as if their warmth could substitute for family. I smiled back because it seemed expected, but behind the smile, the ache gnawed. My phone lay on the bedside table, screen cracked from years of use. For a while I kept it charged, the volume turned high. Every vibration, every ring made, then quietly set the phone aside. I didn't bother plugging it back in. What was the point? Sometimes I watched other residents receive visitors, a daughter bringing flowers, a grandson, tall and handsome, fresh from college, sitting awkwardly as his grandmother patted his hand. The voices drifted down the hallway, warm and apologetic. "Sorry I couldn't come sooner, Grandma. Next time I'll stay longer. Next time we'll go outside, I promise." Next time. That phrase burned inside me like acid. Next time meant someone was counting. Next time meant hope. I had stopped counting. One afternoon, Nurse Lily knocked on my door. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes that didn't feel rehearsed. She brought me chamomile tea, setting it gently on the nightstand. "You're one of the few who still knows what day it is," she teased lightly. I gave her a faint smile. "I keep track." "Why?" she asked, curious. "So I know when to stop hoping," I said, almost before I realized I'd spoken the words. She didn't laugh. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She just nodded, as if she understood more than she said. That night I opened my notebook again. My handwriting was uneven, a little shaky, but determined. I didn't write memories this time. I wrote questions. How do you grieve someone who isn't dead, only done with you? Why does it take leaving a woman in a facility to make her invisible? When did being a mother become the same as being a burden? The ink smudged where my hand trembled, but the words stayed. Days turned to weeks. A month passed. I stopped sitting by the window, stopped watching the garden path for cars that never brought Ethan back. The receptionist stopped asking if I wanted to schedule family visits. Even the other residents stopped assuming I was just. There was a strange sort of freedom in that. One evening, as I sipped tea alone, I wrote in bold letters across the top of a fresh page, "I gave them permission to forget me." I stared at the sentence until my eyes blurred, because it was true. I had believed Ethan's promise. I had carried his comfort like my cross. I had smiled to make it easier for him to leave. I had let him go, and in doing so, I had told him, without words, that it was okay to forget me. The worst part wasn't abandonment. The worst part was realizing how easily I had allowed it. That was the last night I sat by the window, not because I stopped caring about Ethan, but because I started caring about something else, myself. I never intended for anyone to read what I was writing. The notebook was my confession, my anchor, a place to lay down thoughts that were too heavy to carry inside my chest. But pages have a way of speaking, especially when someone is listening. It was Lily who first noticed. One afternoon, she came in to drop off my medication and saw the notebook open on my lap. She smiled. "What are you working on, Mrs. Carter?" "Nothing," I said quickly, closing the cover. She tilted her head, eyes gentle but curious. "Nothing is often something." Her words lingered. That night I read over what I'd written, stories about Linda, my best friend since childhood who had passed years ago, about David, my late husband, who used to whistle Sinatra songs while fixing the porch, about Ethan as a boy, with chocolate on his face from sneaking brownies before dinner. Memories stitched together, fragile but glowing. They reminded me that my life hadn't been a waiting room. The next day, when Lily asked again, I surprised myself by handing her a page. Just one, a story about the time David and I drove to the coast with Ethan in the back seat, and the car broke down. We spent the night singing songs under the stars, eating peanut butter sandwiches by flashlight. Lily read silent, her expression softening. When she looked up, her eyes glistened. "Have you ever thought of sharing these?" I chuckled bitterly. "With who?" She shrugged. "There are ears here, even if the mouths don't move much anymore." The following week, she arranged something small, a table in the activity room, a few chairs, nothing formal. She called it Story Hour. The first time, only 3 people came. One woman dozed off halfway through, another stared at the wall, lost in her own fog, but the third, Margaret, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with hands that trembled when she held her teacup, wept quietly. Afterward, she touched my hand. "Thank you for remembering out loud," she whispered. So I kept writing and reading. I wrote about the day Ethan took his first steps, wobbling toward me with such determination that I cried. I wrote about summer evenings in our backyard, fireflies flickering like tiny lanterns while David grilled burgers. I wrote about the small things, too, the sound of rain on our old roof, the way my mother's perfume lingered on her scarves. Each story stitched me back together, piece by piece, and something unexpected happened. People started listening. Residents who had withdrawn into silence began to smile during my readings. Margaret brought her own journal and shyly read a poem she had written in her 20s. James, a retired math teacher, read a letter he had once written to his wife during the Vietnam War. We weren't just patients anymore. We weren't forgotten names on a clipboard. We were storytellers, witnesses of our own lives. The notebook that had started as my shield became a bridge. One evening, after a reading, Lily lingered. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" she asked. "What's that?" I replied. "You're giving people their voices back." Her words unsettled me, not because they weren't true, but because I hadn't realized it myself. For so long, I had felt voiceless. Ethan's silence had stolen something from me, my identity as a mother, as someone who mattered. But here with these pages, I was no longer invisible. It was a strange, almost guilty realization. Maybe Ethan's absence had forced me to reclaim something I'd forgotten. Myself. That night I sat by the window, notebook open, pen in hand. I didn't wait for cars or footsteps anymore. I waited for words. And they came. They flowed like water, carrying memories, reflections, even laughter. I wrote not for Ethan, not for Jenna, not even for the possibility of being remembered after I was gone. I wrote because my story wasn't finished yet. And when I read those words aloud, the room reminded me of something I had almost lost. I wasn't alone. It started with a blank page that stared at me for days. I'd filled the notebook with memories, reflections, stories that carried me backward and forward through time. But there was one subject I had avoided, a wound I kept pressing around but never into. Ethan. Every time I picked up the pen, I wanted to write his name. Every time I stopped. Because where could I even begin? One afternoon, I finally let the pen touch the page. Dear Ethan, I wrote. Not dear son, that word felt too fragile now, too sacred to use carelessly. He had stepped outside that role the day he left me here. The ink scratched across the paper as I wrote slowly, carefully. Like each word was a stone I had carried for years. I told him what I had seen in his absence. Not the garden outside my window or the bingo nights I never joined, but the truth of what it feels like to be erased. I wrote, Promises rot, Ethan. They don't just fade quietly, they decay. They spread like mold across everything they touch until even love smells sour. I told him I remembered every sacrifice, the nights I worked 2 jobs so he could play baseball, the winters alone, waiting, invisible. I didn't write with anger, not anymore. I wrote with clarity, a stillness sharper than rage. I told him I no longer blamed him, but I no longer waited for him either. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath my notebook. I didn't seal it in an envelope. I didn't plan to send it, because sometimes writing the words is enough, even if they never reach the person they were meant for, especially then. That night, I opened a different folder. My legal documents, the papers I had always kept organized in case of emergencies, and with steady hands I began to rewrite my will. I left small mementos for friends in the facility. Margaret would get the quilt I'd sewn. James would get the chess set Ethan had abandoned years ago. I left the notebooks to Lily because she had been the one who reminded me that my voice mattered. For Ethan, I left nothing. Not out of cruelty, not as punishment, but because love isn't owed, it's shown. And if someone chooses not to show it, then they choose not to receive it either. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep I hadn't known since David passed away. When I woke, the air felt lighter. The silence in my room was no longer suffocating but calm, like a blanket instead of a shroud. Over breakfast the next morning, Margaret asked why I looked different. I smiled. I wrote a letter I'll never send. She tilted her head. Then why write it? Because sometimes, I said, sipping my coffee, you have to empty your heart without expecting anyone else to carry it. She nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. Later, when I sat in the activity room with the others, I didn't read Ethan's letter aloud. That was mine, my private truth. Instead, I read a story about David, about how he once burned dinner so badly that we ended up eating cereal by candlelight, laughing until our stomachs hurt. The room chuckled. Margaret clapped. It struck me then. My son may have chosen silence, but my life didn't have to be silent. I didn't need Ethan to hear me. I had already found my voice. And with every word I wrote, with every story I shared, I realized something profound. The letter I never sent was not an ending. It was the beginning of freedom. Rebellions don't always come with fists raised or banners flying. Sometimes they come quietly, in whispers, in choices that look small on the outside but feel monumental on the inside. By the time 4 months had passed, no one asked me anymore if Ethan was coming back. The receptionist no longer offered to schedule family visits. The other residents had stopped assuming I was only here temporarily. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was furniture. But inside me, a quiet rebellion was blooming. It started with the phone. For weeks I had left it off, the battery drained, the screen black. One afternoon, Lily came by and offered to charge it. "No," I said simply. She blinked. "You don't want to keep it on? Just in case?" "In case of what?" I asked, my voice steady. "In case someone remembers me? If he calls, I don't want to hear it. Not anymore." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mrs. Carter." That was my first rebellion, saying no to hope disguised as waiting. The second came with a visitation schedule. Every month, the staff updated it, penciling in names and times. Even though Ethan hadn't once appeared, my name had remained on the list. I asked them to remove it. "Are you sure?" the receptionist asked gently. "Yes," I said. "Take me off." That was my second rebellion, refusing to leave the door open for someone who never planned to walk through it. With those small acts, something shifted. My energy, once wasted on waiting, began to flow into other things, into people. James, the retired math teacher, had grown withdrawn, rarely speaking, his eyes fixed somewhere. We sat in silence. Then I coaxed him into reading a poem aloud. Just one. He did it reluctantly, voice shaky. But the next week he brought another. Margaret, with her trembling hands, confessed she had once dreamed of being an artist. "But I never had the chance," she said wistfully. "Why not now?" I asked. She laughed as if the idea were absurd. Still, I convinced her to pick up a brush during one of the craft sessions. The first strokes were hesitant, clumsy, but soon colors bloomed across the canvas like flowers. Our little circle grew. We weren't just residents anymore. We were students, teachers, dreamers, people with stories still unfolding. That was my third rebellion, creating a community where no one was invisible. One day I overheard two staff members talking. "The library budget's been cut again," one sighed. "We can barely afford new books." That night I sat in my room and thought about the small savings I still had. Money I had once imagined leaving to Ethan. Now the thought of him inheriting anything from me felt hollow. The next week I spoke quietly with the facility director and made a donation. Not much, but enough to buy new books, journals, and art supplies. I asked to remain anonymous. The director agreed. But Lily knew. She always knew. "You're investing in stories," she said softly. I smiled. What else is there worth investing in? That was my fourth rebellion, giving my love to where it would be valued instead of wasted. I continued to write in my notebook every night, not about Ethan, not anymore, but about us. About the community we were building, about the laughter that now bubbled up during story hour, about the way Margaret's eyes lit up when she painted, or the way James began reciting poetry with confidence. One evening, Lily asked if I ever regretted cutting Ethan out of my... "That's a kind of wealth, isn't it?" "Yes," I replied. "The only kind that matters now." Looking back, the rebellions were small, refusing to charge a phone, crossing my name off a list, sharing stories, donating a little money. But they weren't small to me. To me, they were thunder and silence. Each act said, "I am not forgotten furniture. I am a woman. I am alive, and I still choose." And sometimes, choosing is the loudest rebellion of all. The holidays came with garlands and blinking lights strung across the halls. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, and someone played carols on a speaker that crackled with static. Nurses wore Santa hats. Some residents wore reindeer headbands. There was laughter, forced at times, but real enough to warm the air. Everywhere I looked, there was anticipation. Some residents had families coming. A daughter arrived with the poinsettia plant, her perfume lingering long after she left. A grandson in a college sweatshirt sat awkwardly beside his grandmother, scrolling his phone between bursts of conversation. The receptionist shuffled schedules, balancing who came when, making sure everyone had their time. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't expect anything, that I was perfectly fine. But truth has a way of whispering louder when you try to silence it. I remembered the holidays when Ethan was little, the way his eyes sparkled when he tore through wrapping paper, the smell of pine filling the living room, my husband, David, wearing his ridiculous red sweater, carving the turkey like it was an Olympic sport, the house bursting with noise and warmth. Now, all I had was the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of paper decorations taped to the walls. I wasn't bitter, but I was lonely. On Christmas Eve, Lily knocked on my door carrying a small package. She placed it on my nightstand. "From me to you," she said with a grin. I peeled back the wrapping to find a leather-bound journal and a silver pen with my name engraved. "Just in case you run out of pages," she said softly. My throat tightened. I pulled her into a hug, one that wasn't polite or careful, but real, full of gratitude. That night I sat by the window. Snow drifted gently over the garden, the roses buried under white. I opened the journal and wrote 3 words on the first page. "I forgive you." Not because Ethan had earned forgiveness. He hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't even sent a card. I forgave him so I could finally set myself free. There was no knock at the door, no car pulling into the driveway, no hurried footsteps coming down the hallway. But for the first time, I didn't crumble under the weight of that absence. Instead, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop expecting someone to do what they never intended to. A few days later, the staff held a small event called Living Legacies. Residents were invited to share something, a memory, a story, a piece of themselves worth passing on. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, journal in hand. My voice shook at first, but then steadied as I read aloud a memory of David. The year he burned the Thanksgiving turkey so badly the smoke alarm went off, and we ended up eating cereal by candlelight. Ethan was 6, laughing so hard milk came out his nose. The room burst into laughter. For a moment, even the walls seemed to echo with joy. Afterward, a young nurse approached me quietly. "My dad's still alive," she said, almost confessing, "but I haven't visited him in over a year. I think I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked gently. She hesitated. "Afraid of seeing what I've become. Afraid of facing my absence." I didn't tell her what to do. It wasn't my place. But I did say, "Love doesn't expire, but it does move on if you leave it waiting too long." She nodded, tears in her eyes. That night I had believed his absence was a wound I could never recover from. But now I realized something different. Sometimes the visit that never comes is its own kind of gift, because it forces you to stop waiting for someone else to give your life meaning, because it teaches you to become your own company, and in doing so, you stop being someone hoping to be remembered. You become someone worth remembering. Legacy. People often think of it as money, houses, jewelry passed down in velvet boxes, something solid, something measurable. But in the quiet halls of this place, legacy felt different, fragile, almost invisible, like breath fogging a mirror, fleeting yet undeniable. One winter afternoon, Lily asked me if I'd be willing to read to residents in the memory care unit. "They don't always understand," she warned gently, "but sometimes they just like the sound of a voice." At first I hesitated. What could I possibly give them? I wasn't a saint. I wasn't even sure I had anything left worth offering. but I went. I read simple things, fairy tales, short news articles, passages from my own journal. At first, there was no reaction. Blank stares, silence. One woman hummed softly to herself, lost in her own rhythm. But then something shifted. A man smiled when I read about my childhood dog. A woman closed her eyes and swayed slightly when I described dancing in the kitchen with David. And one lady, who hadn't spoken in weeks, whispered a single word after I finished. Beautiful. It struck me. Maybe legacy isn't about what we leave behind, but what we leave within. From then on, I visited the memory unit every week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Margaret or James. I read, they listened. And in those moments, we weren't patients. We weren't forgotten. We were alive, connected, human. That realization changed. I thought my legacy had ended the moment he walked out of that door, but I was wrong. I didn't want to be remembered as a woman whose story ended in silence. I wanted to be remembered as someone who turned pain into presence. So I started a group, Voices from the Garden. Every Thursday afternoon, a handful of us gathered in the activity room. Each person brought a memory, a story, a poem. Some were funny, some heartbreaking, some scattered and fragmented, but every single one mattered. James read about his first teaching job. Margaret shared the memory of her wedding dress, stitched by her mother's hands. Even residents who rarely spoke began to murmur words, fragments of their own lives. The staff began to sit in, listening quietly, sometimes even joining. The room filled with laughter, tears, applause. For the first time in a long time, we weren't defined by what we had lost. We were defined by what we still carried inside. That, I realized, was legacy. One evening, I took out my legal papers again. I had already rewritten my will, leaving nothing to Ethan. But now I knew where I wanted my estate to go. I arranged for most of it to fund senior programs, libraries, art classes, music workshops in underfunded communities, places where voices, like ours, might otherwise fade. When I told Lily, she asked softly, "Does it feel good, knowing you've done that?" "No," I said, smiling faintly. "It feels true." Truth, I had learned, is the only inheritance that doesn't rot. For Ethan, my absence would be the only inheritance left. For the people here, my presence was enough. That night, after another session of Voices from the Garden, Margaret touched my arm. "You know," she said, "if it weren't for you, I would have gone the rest of my life believing I didn't matter anymore." Her words sank deep. I thought about Ethan again, not with anger, but with clarity. He had chosen to forget me, but that didn't mean I had to forget myself, and I hadn't. I had built something unexpected, something fragile yet strong, a legacy that didn't sit in banks or safety deposit boxes. It lived in stories. It lived in laughter. It lived in the way Margaret's brush touched canvas, the way James's voice carried across the room, the way a woman in memory care whispered, "Beautiful." Long after I'm gone, I thought, maybe no one will speak my name, but the ripples of my voice will remain. That, I realized, was more than enough. I used to wonder how my story would end. Not in the dramatic sense. No grand speeches, no cinematic exits. Just how it would feel. Turns out, endings feel quieter than I imagined. Like morning light slipping through half-closed curtains. Like hot tea cupped between two steady, aging hands. Like peace. Margaret, it was a Saturday afternoon. The air outside was crisp, the garden dusted with the last traces of winter. James was in the activity room, reading a poem with the same booming voice he once used in the classroom. Margaret was at the art table, a splash of yellow blooming across her canvas. Someone was tinkling on the piano, off-key but full of joy. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the new journal Lily had given me balanced on my lap. Pages filled with stories stretched behind me. My past, my pain, my rediscovery. And now only a handful of blank pages remained. I thought about Ethan. Not with rage, not with despair, just with the clarity of someone who has finally stopped bleeding from an old wound. He hadn't come back. Not for the holidays, not for spring, not at all. Maybe one day he would. Maybe he wouldn't. It didn't matter anymore, because I no longer lived my life in the waiting room of his return. The scent of peach pie drifted from the kitchen. Life moved, not perfectly, but beautifully. I remembered the fear I'd had when I first arrived, the terror of being invisible, discarded, erased. And I remembered the woman who had sat by the window, staring down the garden path, begging for a son who had already let go. She was gone now. In her place sat someone freer, someone who no longer measured her worth by who walked through a door, someone who had found her voice and used it not only to save herself, but to lift others. Later that evening, Lily stopped by. She carried 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me in the cool air. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable, soft. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever regret it, cutting ties, refusing to wait?" I thought carefully. Then I shook my head. No, because regret belongs to those who had no choice, and I chose. Her eyes shone. You did. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, I closed the journal. I would fill the remaining pages soon, but I didn't feel rushed. Stories, like seasons, arrive in their own time. I wasn't racing toward an ending anymore. I was simply living. The final page, I realized, wouldn't be written by absence. It wouldn't be written by Ethan or Jenna or anyone else who chose to turn away. It would be written by me, by the tomatoes I planned to grow in the spring, by the laughter shared over burnt cookies in the activity room, by the whispered prayers I still offered at night, not for Ethan's return, but for my own peace. And in that peace, I found freedom. I used to believe the worst thing that could happen to a mother was being left behind. But it's not. The worst thing is never realizing that life still waits for you, even after they leave you. That night I fell asleep not with sadness, but with a quiet joy humming in my... And in that choice, I was free.